Okay. Thank you, Robert. As you probably know from getting to know Robert, he's one of the pillars of this school. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present to you, and I thank Robert for the opportunity. I just want to give you a little background because it's going to inform this presentation. I studied architecture at the AA in London, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, the experience of studying architecture for me was just a transformation, complete transformation. And first year was probably the biggest year in terms of that transformation. Really intense program, and at the end of that time, I was just kind of burned out and not really sure about architecture. So I was working in architectural offices, but I sort of built up this idea that I would study meditation, and so I spent about 10 years working in offices and traveling, studying meditation. And after that period of time, I was actually more confused about what I really wanted to do because I couldn't reconcile the built world with the inner world. I felt like going to school in London, the professors were always saying, oh, you know, don't bother with the book, just go down that street and see that building, or go to Paris, or go to Berlin. And anyone who goes to school in Europe takes advantage of that. But I didn't know how to reconcile that built world with the inner world, which I had begun to look into. And so then, you know, in a kind of, you know, it didn't really, I don't know why I did it, but I decided I'd get a degree in psychology. I went back to school, did a master's degree in psychology. And it was while I was studying psychology that I felt I could put these two worlds together. And, you know, began teaching and writing about that. And so I'm going to talk about a few different things. First, I want to talk about just an idea of what human beings are from a psychological point of view and how that's useful to architects. And then I want to talk about the creative process from a psychological point of view, because I think one of the things that brings us here is we love to create things, and I think it's really important. Then I want to talk a little bit about the process of design, because design is a special kind of creativity, and it's an incredible challenge. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about emotions and design. I know you've had a full day, and I wasn't even supposed to present tonight. I was supposed to be like 3 weeks ago. So the fact that we're meeting tonight, I can't explain. But that's how it turned out. So is that in focus, Jalia? Yeah? Is that good? Great. Okay, so that's what I'd like to cover. You know, interrupt at any time if you feel moved. Just ask a question. Otherwise, I'm just going to move into this material. So first, this is my kind of diagram of studying architecture. And the way it works is, and it really hasn't changed. In fact, I asked Rick Andrighetti what your first project was. He said you're designing an artist studio. True? That was my first project. It nearly killed me. It was crazy. Like, you get the plan together, and then someone says, what about the section? And you change the section, then you've got to go back to do the elevation. And I mean, it was just a lot of coffee, and it was fantastic. And, you know, I sort of fell in love with that whole process. But the way I see it is we sort of start by giving you guys a relatively simple problem in the scale of all buildings, even though it's pretty complex. And then this is the thing we don't tell you everything. We give you a simple project, and then every year we're going to give you a more complex project. And that's above the line. That's what you present. But the thing that I became very interested in is everything below the line, like how you actually figure out internally how to deal with figuring out the issues of design, your own creativity, what you like to do. You know, do you have a right to suggest such a thing in your project? All of that we're left on our own to figure out. Now, by the time I got to third year, like in our school, the third year project was like a city. I designed a city for 10,000 people. 3 years before, it was like an artist's house. So I didn't really know how to do that, just like I didn't know how to do what happened in first year. But if you pass, you just get to do a more complex thing every year. So these things underneath, really inside, were the things that I became more and more interested in. And then finally, what we do here, which is incredible, when you go to the master's program, we completely change it. We don't give you something to do. You have to tell us what you want to do, and it completely screws people up. So master's students are kind of like in first year again. And believe me, I want to make sure no one's here right now. I'm teaching TRD1 now, and it's really hard for everybody, really hard. It's just incredible. People are really anxious. People are really worried and stressed by it, even though they've built up this kind of aptitude to do more and more complex problems. So I'd like to talk about this. I'd like to talk particularly what's under this line, and hopefully it's helpful to you in your work. This is an image I want to start with, because to me it sort of points out what's so interesting right now. Like so have people been here? A few of you have been here? Don't live too far from here, and so while it was being built, it's one of those buildings, when it's under construction, it looks like it's under destruction. It was incredible watching this get built, and I used to just hang out here and overhear conversations about the building. So, here's my view. I don't want to even talk about the building, actually, but here's what I want to say. This is what museums looked like for hundreds of years. The whole society agreed that's what a museum looked like. And if you travel to different cities, you can kind of spot museums. And then in the 20th century, things start to change until we get to 2008, and suddenly this is a museum. And I think what this says to me, even though some people will say, oh yeah, technology, that's changed everything. Or economics, that's changed everything. Or definitely computers, globalization. My view is what's changed is psychology. I think there was an invention about 100 years ago that allowed for the creative act to shift from the society to the individual. So what happens now is when the museum needs an architect, they don't really know what a museum is. The architect has to tell them, oh, this is a museum in 2008, that's a museum. No one knows anymore what a museum is. It's going to be your call. And I think that's incredibly liberating and terrifying. But that's the new world. So my interest is, how does psychology give us the resources to actually be able to say what something is? How do we have the know-how outside of what's above that line to actually express something about a museum? So I like this photograph a great deal because it's not that long ago that, let's say maybe that's my grandmother as a baby. But 150 years ago, 200 years ago, you did what your parents did. You probably lived in their house for a long time. You read the same books. You had the same beliefs. But because of this shift I'm talking about, suddenly generations have to generate something of their own. That process of becoming an individual is actually very important. It's not that we lose the relationship with our parents. It's just in the modern era, the expectation is that you're going to go and do something unique. And I'm not voting for that to be a self-centered act or not. It's just that the rules have changed, I think. I mean, even today in a family portrait, it'd be unlikely for the dresses to match, unless it was like a Halloween thing, So, jumping forward a little bit, I want to say something about anatomy. Around this time, it becomes possible to do a dissection. And so, the intelligence of Western science starts to label everything inside a human being. We may not know how it all works, but we know that the metatarsal is connected to such a bone. We know how ligaments work. And when you read accounts of these dissections, because they were public, sort of like going to, an IMAX movie, like it was really something people wanted to go to the first dissection in town. It happened in an operating theater. And I always think, you've probably seen those images of the stepped seating in an operating theater. The part The reason it's called a theater is it's dramatic. They didn't know what they'd find in there. They might find the psyche. They might find the soul. They didn't even know what was in there. And there was a kind of superstition they might find something. So I have to spend 1 second on this diagram. It's kind of the most technical thing I want to talk about, but it sort of sets up a lot of ideas. Just like I showed you a dissection, the kind of physical anatomy, this is sort of the psychic anatomy of everybody. Not just someone interested in psychology. This is, you could be born in Peshawar, you could be born in Pickering. This is, from a psychological point of view, here you are. And this is after a model by C.G. Jung, a great psychologist. But let me just give you the basics. E stands for ego. And as Jung said, we have sovereignty over what we're conscious of. That's our ego. Our ego gets us what we want. Do you want sugar in your tea or honey? Ego tells you. And you need a strong ego as a designer, because as a designer, you're always making choices. But, and this is the great thing, under that line is the unconscious, where a lot of things rest. And I'm going to talk about 3 things: dreams, body, and shadow, and what they have to do with creativity and decision-making in this modern era. Now, the thing about the ego, and the reason I feel I can mention this to you in a school of architecture is, let's say all of us decide to have a coffee at 6 o'clock tomorrow at the Melville. So we could agree to that, and we would all show up at 6 o'clock. So we'd get our coffee. But if I say to you, I want you to have a great idea tomorrow at 6 o'clock, no guarantee anything will happen. See, creativity is something we receive. It's not something we get. And almost all the rules around creativity are slightly shifted, I think, from how we normally get things in the world. And that's a kind of education in itself. So what I want to do quickly is run through these 3 pieces under the line and talk about how they might meet creativity and design. The reason those lines are dotted is because even though they emerge, like a dream is the same as creativity. If I say to you, I want you to have a dream tonight, or even if you say that to yourself, the chances of that happening are not really under conscious or control of the ego. So we're going to talk about dreams, not to say you need to have a dream to be an architect, but the dreams speak through symbols, and I think architecture has a role to play in that, as I'll explain. When it comes to body, how could the body be unconscious? Well, if you have a big presentation, you get a bad headache just before the presentation. That's not something you're choosing. There seems to be an unconscious wisdom at work there, which we want to have a relationship with. And the same for shadow, which in a psychological sense just means problems. We want to have a relationship with them so we can make them part of our creative process. That's the new reality, the 21st century reality. So that's my portrait of every human being. So let's start with dreams. One of the reasons that I think dreams are really interesting is, as I said, they're not corrupted by us. They come to us, we receive them. They're not corrupted by our personal needs and desires. They come to us. And so when you have a dream, everyone will say things like, oh, I was in the kitchen, or I was in the basement, or I'm in the garage, I'm in the attic. The question psychologists ask themselves is, why would the dream situate itself in a specific place? And if you ask a person this question, they say, oh, I only dreamed about the kitchen because I was in the kitchen yesterday. You say, well, were you in other rooms yesterday? Yeah, I was in hundreds of rooms. Why the kitchen? So from a psychological point of view, there's symbolic meaning in that space. It's a space of assimilation. It's telling us the dream is maybe about digesting something. And we can go through every setting there is on this earth, and they are existing on 2 levels, I think. And I always use this example of the porch to make this point. When you come to first year, that's a porch. Everyone agrees, I think it's a porch. Any disputing of that being a porch? So So it's a porch. And then sometime in first year, it becomes a threshold. Or maybe by second year, it's a threshold. Then you take a certain course in third year with a certain professor. It's not a porch. It's not a threshold. It's a liminal space. Amazing. And you take that into your studies. And then maybe in fourth year, it's none of those things. It's become a transitional space. And so you do your thesis on liminal and transitional spaces. And then you graduate, become an architect, and the phone rings. It's your aunt. Can you design a porch for me? And for me, this is the best thing of all. Architecture is both physical and metaphysical. That's why it has meaning. That's why it's got some power. If it was only physical, that wouldn't be the case. And the dream helps us understand that. I'm not saying you need to remember your dreams, although it may be of interest to you. But it points out to us that the world exists on these two levels, I think. And as I've mentioned earlier, Jung felt strongly that one of the reasons people are upset somehow in the world is there's no resonance with this. The world is treated as just a physical thing, for instance. Life is too rational. There's no symbolic existence. And then, in fourth year, you go to Rome, and all of a sudden you're in a world where there is somehow a relationship with other ideas about built things. And I think it's very moving to people to see their world expand in that fashion. It actually agrees with people. Now, I'm not at all saying that we should be designing, antiquities. I don't believe that. I think the interesting thing is that your generation, like the generation before it, has to come up with its own symbols. And this quote by Marion Woodman, a famous psychologist, tells us we have to kind of reinvent, reimagine the mystery. And that's what our contemporary creative work asks us to do. There's got to be new imagery. That kind of activity, that kind of experience is not of the 18th century. And I quickly want to show you just a sort of interesting hybrid of physical, metaphysical building. It's a wedding chapel in Japan, perforated screen. There's a room behind it. The veil kind of lifts at the right time. They live happily ever after. One more point about the dream that I want to make is, and I just want you to sort of reflect on this, the artist is doing for the society what dreams do for the individual. Why would anybody wrap a building? Are you kidding me? Like, do you know how hard it is to get permission to, do anything? And you go to the authorities and say, I have an idea. I'd like to wrap this building up. And, through the kind of grace of culture, something like this happens. But it's the job of the artist, the job of the creative person to actually put forth these images because society can't see itself. Just like we need dreams, I think, to see ourselves more clearly. So now a few words about the shadow. I got so interested in things that were kind of imperfect. And I mean, that's inevitable as you get older, but it's also a kind of comfort. And so, if you Google broken bowls on the internet, you start seeing things that I think have a really appealing kind of beauty. So shadow and the role of imperfection, or what to do with difficulty. In Japan, there was a tradition of repairing these tea bowls, whether they were valuable or not, and they would send them to China. This is in the 15th century. This is like before Perolator, FedEx. Send this little bowl to China, and you got it back 2 years later, and it was somehow repaired. If you look at the examples, they're stitched. They actually pass a little wire through the clay. And then one prince in Japan in the 15th century said, I don't want to send our stuff away. We'll do it in-house. And someone in his community started repairing these bowls by putting gold in the seams. In other words, the broken thing was actually the value of the thing. And these became precious and collected because they were somehow renewed in a very, very meaningful way. And there was a big exhibition of them in Washington, D.C. about 5 years ago. And so, as I said, I got more and more interested in broken things. And it drew me to this carpenter. He was trained as an architect, practiced as an architect, George Nakashima. Incredible life story, interned during the war, treated like garbage. And the only wood he could get his hands on was wood people didn't want. So farmers would call him and say, we've cut down a tree, would you like a piece of the stump? He had no money, young family. And so this piece of his, which is about 2 meters long, is cut through the stump of a walnut tree. So there's as much missing as there is there. And you know, from a rational point of view, that's a useless table. But from a point of view of saying something about the fact that nothing's perfect, we can still thrive and find beauty in that world. This is a beautiful thing. If you're ever near Philadelphia, in New Hope, his daughter is running this studio, and she's a friend of the school in a way. She's been here. I hope you'll visit there one day. Another place where you see sort of the broken or the imperfect is in nature. It's not often that people say, let's cut that tree down. It's so misformed. Generally, those things are revered. You know, things survive, and they have a beauty of their own in spite of what they've been through. You know, I continued to collect these images, like of broken toys. Anything broken I became interested in because I feel like this is a good portrait of human beings. This is what it's like sometimes. Just human. Even the people at the front of this room can attest to that. Like, that's human. And I don't know if the work of Andy Goldsworthy, has that crossed your path? So many interesting people. I mean, his work, I think, really plays on this theme, largely made in nature. This tradition of scholars' rocks, which was cultivated in Asia, China in particular, you know, any poet or philosopher had to have this on his desk. When you're stuck, that's what you need to study, the kind of unlikely ways that things are beautiful. And, you know, in the 21st century, that gets translated into architecture. I think the meaning, and this is Frank Gehry, I don't know if it's part of your work yet, but this is the core of a bank in Germany. That's a country that has an imperfect history, as we all do. But what a thing to put in the heart of the building. No one knew what this was, what to do with it. It's a room. The building was so popular, they moved the bank out, and it just became a kind of conference center. Old barns, you know, talking about local things, old barns, people always like ruins. And I think it's not just a love of history, people feel comfortable, as they do in nature, when they're not surrounded by perfection. It's just impossible. It's impossible to be imperfect in this perfect condition all the time. So these kinds of architectures, I think, have great appeal. They free us, frankly. And then all of a sudden, you know, it's possible to do things that you don't have to make a rational argument for. Excuse me. Louis Kahn, have you gone through Louis Kahn's work at all? I mean, it's very, in some ways, rigid, but there's moments where things get very broken. So by shadow, I'm talking about the capacity to incorporate not just the personal parts of oneself, but the difficulties that are just inherent in anything that's designed. It's difficult. We have to find a way to incorporate that. Now I want to talk about body, this third element. You know the painter Edward Munch who did The Scream? Anyone ever seen that? It's kind of famous. This is a piece of his. You know, he was a very, I think, psychologically aware painter. If you've ever been to like Georgian Bay or on the beach and you fall asleep on a warm rock or on the beach, you know, your body just turns into all the material around you. And I think this is a really sophisticated modern view of the body where we're just talking about its energy. And that's something that we don't do, I think, as much as we could in a university. We're promoting your intellectual health, but we tend not to give the body a chance to make decisions. Whereas it's very tuned to doing that, very capable. You know, one of my favorite examples of this bias is Easter Island. These are obviously called the heads of Easter Island, discovered in the 18th century. Everyone knows about the heads of Easter Island. And then, in the 21st century, they actually excavated for the first time the head, and they were shocked with what they found. They found a body under the head. How could that be? And it shows you how far we've... It shows you the depth of our bias, in a sense. And as architects, everything's physical, in one sense. We encounter the world physically, we touch things, their materiality is universal. This is a quote from Joseph Campbell. We've got a great DVD of his in the library called Power of Myth. If you have time, really recommend it. But he says, clearly, this consciousness thinks it's running the shop. But it's secondary to the total human being, must not be put in control. It must serve the humanity of the body. So what is the humanity of the body? The humanity of the body is this. I think we all get thirsty on hot days. It doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter what you've been through, we get thirsty on hot days. That's universal. There's no difference fundamentally between people on a physical level. These things affect all of us. So I want to show you a series of portraits that this painter did, Alex Gray, and these were done life-size. And the ones previous to this are just anatomy drawings. But then he said, I want to draw the body as both physical and spiritual. So you can see here the skeletal system, the venal system, nervous system, all the subtleties of the physical body, and he's imposed on it a layer of what is reputed to be the energy of the body. We have time later, we can do an exercise around this, but here's what I wanted to say. This would be you in a normal state. Like if we had a special camera, this is what you look like if you're awake. There's energy, it surrounds your body. There are these centers of energy that correspond to emotional and physical conditions in the body. And so here you are on a morning, you've woken up. And then he went one step further and said, what's it like when you're really immersed in something, like you're at a movie you really like? No one, if it's a good movie, you don't know what time it is. You don't know if you have kidneys. You don't know. Your body's doing so much for you every day. You don't know any of that, especially if you're, and here you see what's happening. The body's starting to disappear. So I'd say it's a good movie. He hasn't looked at his watch once. And it's a really impressive, I think, portrait of what we look like energetically when we're really absorbed in something. And then he goes one step further, like here's a peak experience in your life, something really, you've just run the marathon, or, you've just maybe skied down an incredible hill, or you've just finished dancing or making something. And like this is the experience you could have. You could read an amazing book and not know that 4 hours passed. You're barely aware of anything architecturally. So this would be a portrait of you in that state. And the reason I think this is important is because as architects we deal with material all the time, and your clients are going to deal with this, and the people who adjudicate whether you can build or not. This is the world we're all in now. So take this ancient church door. Here's the part of the door that opens if you just walk in. So there's the door for the physical body. It's rather modest, just this much. So then there's another huge door. That's like the emotional door. That's for when emotions need to enter the room. And then, this whole frame, that's like, your whole spiritual life enters that room. And then here are your ancestors. They're invited also. Everybody's entering this building. So of course when you go inside, you say, peaceful. I kind of like this place. Well, you finally were invited in. All of you, not just the physical body, the whole body, all its layers and complexities invited in. And I think one of the things we're trying to do as modern architects is find a language for this. How do you show some radiance in a building? Church of the Reconciliation of Berlin. Great story. I'll leave it with Robert to fill that in on another date.
I rented an apartment literally which right behind that building for 2 months, 2 best months of my life.
Beautiful. Now, the reason we want to make contact with this is that energy is going to be very useful for you in a creative sense. And as I move into this, I want to talk a little bit more about how to work with that. But when I think of interesting contemporary work, this is one aspect of it. This is a psychologist talking about things that you know in your body. We constantly know things in our body. We know whether we like people, spaces, people, it changes. We did like that person, we don't. Our body tells us, often before we've thought it through. And for some people, this is the primary way they understand the world. Even though you have to write essays, some people would be much more comfortable using their body as a kind of medium to test what makes sense or not. And Joseph Campbell, again, had a very famous quote about this: follow your bliss. Essentially, as a creative person, you want to follow what excites you. You don't want to be told what to do. You have something to say. And this I think, piece of guidance is very helpful as a creative person. Anything is possible. Just remember that museum. No one knows what this museum is. You have to follow your energy, I think. Now, I have to mention this before I move on because it was an invention of Jung's that maybe you've heard about the Myers-Briggs test in high school. Anyone have to do that? So everyone, was kind of proportioned in some fashion, but Jung invented this. He simply said, there are these 4 components of every human being, and anything can be at the top, like feeling could be at the top, intuition, sensing. You can turn the dial. And he said, basically, 1 is going to be the way you constantly solve problems, because you were born with that. 2, he said, will help you, and the 4th one is kind of asleep. And he pointed out that in life, you actually need all 4. Like, you might be great at thinking, but what if you have to do something around the issue of feeling? You need that. So the work of a lifetime, he claimed, was to make sure all of these were things you were comfortable with. So I need to mention this because I want to bring this up in creative work. How to know, this is a sort of contemplation. It's not really, you are this. No. Something that changes over the course of a life, and you could just think about it. But if you're with a group of friends and you order pizza, or better still, you say, who wants pizza? Thinking type? I think I'll have pizza. They'll just tell you they're thinkers. Feelers? I feel like having pizza. They just can't help it. That's what they are. They'll talk about feelings. Sensing, they're going to go into the mushrooms and the cheese. They're sensing types. Sensing types create differently from thinking types. Intuition, the best example of that is a student here a number of years ago did an absolutely great project. It was so different from everyone else in the class. It was uncanny. And so at the end of the term, I just went up to her. I said, why'd you do that? She goes, I don't know. Intuition. It just comes in and you have to do it. Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse for not thinking. If you ask a thinker why they're doing something, they'll talk for like half an hour. Everyone has their own way of learning. And part of the job over the next how many years you're here is to figure out, how do I learn? What helps me? We can do that today. I would say even 50 years ago, they told you how to learn. It's so, it's actually cruel. People have their own way to learn and their own way to be creative. So I hope our school really promotes this idea of the individual having a choice. So now, the creative life. How are we doing? Creativity is so important. And as architects, when you're sitting with clients, building inspectors, bankers, whoever is at the table, the architect is the only person who's trained to actually imagine things. Everyone else has their jurisdiction. We have a unique jurisdiction, which I think is under-argued. in terms of its importance in our culture. So, you know, I asked myself this question: why are there so many lemon juice squeezers in the world? Come on, I mean, do we need 100,000 lemon juice squeezers? And even if I try and, like, okay, this one's porcelain, but that one's plastic, that's a metal one, but that's a very different metal one, you know, there's no end to it. So I couldn't really draw a conclusion. So then, okay, chairs of the 20th century. Let's get to the bottom of this. Why are so many people doing different chairs? And, you know, oh, the plastic ones are curvaceous. No, so are the cardboard ones. You know, the upholstered ones are kind of like that, but then so is the wooden one. And again, it breaks down. There's no rule I could find. So I thought, well, probably my fault. I'm looking at weird things. Tea kettles. There's hundreds of thousands of designs of tea kettles. What's with that? You know, why didn't it just stop at this one, you know, or that one? And I think the reason there are so many different kinds of everything is designers have something to say. We're no different from musicians or poets. And you hopefully enjoy having something to say, because that's kind of your job when you show up at the table. I'm not saying that that isn't something that needs to get educated. In fact, that's what we do here. We try and educate that instinct. But that's what's unique, and that's what the world needs very much from us. So, why would you make a stair like that, Frank? What's gotten into you? And you know, this is where people just stand and take photographs. They don't know what it is. They just know they're in the presence of the creative spirit. People want a piece of that. So even though we're terribly serious about our designs, I think the whole idea of creativity requires play, a playfulness. Otherwise, it's very difficult to create. You know, that's a ramp for wheelchair access. Never seen one like that before until Frank Gehry did it. I particularly like architecture that gets people's posture to change. Not because they're in a chair, but, you know, somehow really goes into the physiology. That was an idea that became a built thing that is really touching this person. This is a shoe store in Lisbon. So it's like a good news, bad news thing. You get the first commission in your professional life. We want you to design a shoe store for us. Fantastic. What's the budget? 8 cans of paint from Canadian Tire. Do you want the job? We have to take the job. No one else can do this. So Jung talked about creativity as one of the instincts, and this is an interesting list, I think. Creativity, like my wife likes to take photographs, so we were driving on the highway in Arizona. There's not a thing around. There's just like tumbleweed crossing the highway. And we're in the middle of this beautiful plain, and she's, stop the car, stop the car. I thought, okay, we've hit somebody. Why? I need to take a photograph. Creative instinct. And you want to recognize that when it comes up in you. That makes life easy. Now, he included, and it's worth mentioning, not religion in the formal sense, that he saw every culture had a need for meaning. Really important. That's instinctual. That's not intellectualized. We need that. And also built into us a sense of aggression, the appetites of sex and hunger. You don't have to think about hunger. If you're hungry, you're hungry. So these instincts are really important, and creativity he classified as one of these. So here's my diagram of sort of the architectural instinct kind of unpacked. You can take this or leave it. I'm just sharing it with you because this is the way I think about it. But it starts with being open. If you're not open to what you're doing, not much is going to happen. So, you know, in some ways that means being vulnerable or being willing to listen inwardly. But we have to be open. And I think the reason we have to be open is because that will cause us to be moved. You know, no one questions this with music. You put on something great to listen to, and people start dancing. They're moved. If they're not open, it's hard to be moved. the reason we need to be moved is insight. Insight isn't that I was moved. It's kind of thinking about why was I moved. You know, if you like a particular architect, does anyone like an architect? Sometimes people won't admit it. Does anyone have a favorite architect? Horta. So my question to you is to write out why. It's not enough to say, I like Horta. Why? And go into it. Really go into it. It will yield a lot of things. And that insight becomes part of our understanding about architecture. And at that understanding stage, we're usually communicating with others. You know, show your project to the community of peers. And this just keeps going thousands of times over the course of your education. That's one of the things I think is under that line. You guys looking at this? Okay, so it's a wild reindeer center. Tell me what a wild reindeer center looks like. So Snoetta said, this is a wild reindeer center. Instinct. I mean, you know, you'd have to talk to them. And if you read accounts of people creating things, they will go into it. Yeah, that's a really beautiful project, I think. Now here's what year would this be? 16th, 15th century maybe? This is how we used to think about an idea. You know, it came from above. It came from, it was sort of a sacred thing. And in the 21st century, you know, we've kind of made a science of it. And I think it's sort of interesting. Like right now, let's say if we could have you all wired, we'd basically be in beta state, awake, normal, alert, unless you could be in a delta, like a deep dream right now, I don't know, but judging most people here, beta state. And this should be in our library. We need this in our library. If you're not feeling creative, maybe you're in a beta state. You need to get to an alpha state. So I've been fortunate to teach this elective in the graduate program where we can actually practice getting into alpha states. That's something we need to get good at, and there's a whole science behind this. So in my view, like part of what we need to do in studio is spend time in those alpha states. We need to get into those less pressured, more relaxed, more dreamlike states. That's where things come in. That's when we're receptive. So whether you take the occasional yoga class or you just need to lie down on a sofa while you're working, I think we need more of that. We need hot tubs and saunas in the building. We need people to just relax and get creative, not pressured. Now, two of the things that I think you can do if you're in an alpha state that are really amazing design tools is visualization and active imagination. If I say right now, here's visualization. If I say to you, visualize in your mind's eye the Eiffel Tower. Most people get a little image of that, little sense of it briefly. We innately have that capacity, but as architects, we can really develop that. And that's a design tool. Should it be like this or that? We can visualize the answer much quicker than draw it. So I'm not talking about a visualization like a 3D model. I'm talking about an idea in the mind. Active imagination is a version of that that's more elaborate, where it might involve, you know, if I'm walking to the house and I turn the corner and I come to the front door and I open the door, it's a longer narrative that we have the capacity to run through and turn into a question about our design work. Everyone does this. No one talks about it. We're starting to teach it. So what I think is when you're working, it's really important to give the problem to your imagination. Your imagination has quite literally billions of years of training in imagining. You know, the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, is the most recent part. All this development so that we could imagine. It's a great gift. And we're actually, I think, on the cusp of teaching how to work with this. Not just always, you know, suffering. So one of the principles of this is the idea of listening. Because, you know, like I said, if you're trying to get something, you're actually not as open as when you're receptive. So there's a training that needs to happen, I think, where you stop for a moment and you're actually tuning in inwardly. And you might be a person who sees it, who feels it, who thinks it. It's still received. And I think it's a huge advantage and makes life much easier. I'll admit right now, it took me many years of being in school to let go of trying to control every design move. But at a certain point, due to a catastrophic fourth-year project, I just decided I'm just going to tune into what is going on inwardly. And that became my methodology, which drives me to this day. So, I asked myself, what is a unit of design? Like, you could have a kilometer per hour, you can have kilopascals per second. What's a unit of design? I think a unit of design is simply a question answered. So consciously you say, what's it like? Something you're working on. What's it like? And if you frame that question, all you're doing is tuning into what that answer is. If nothing's there, move on to another question. So here's a day in the studio. What's going on? I do desk crits for a living. That's all I do, basically. So I got very interested in talking to people about what they were up to. So you get to somebody's desk. Of course, they're really busy, and they take off their headphones when you show up. So they remember what Robert told them. They're listening to Adele. Drake is all right sometimes. Hunger Games, That's going on. And yet we're trying to design something as though none of this exists. My approach is to give the problem to whatever inspires you. How would Adele design an artist studio? What would Drake do with that project? If you're listening to him, you're moved by him. He's not going to do it, you're going to do it. But this is a way of actually being conscious of the things that are moving you. And it doesn't matter what you bring to it. The blank one is just like zoning out, Nothing's going on. And let's say these are the things that you pull forward. I would quite like what I've done, and of course everyone has their own way, but I just imagine I'm at a table with someone from Six Nations, with Adele, she's at the table, Zaha's there, someone just finished Tai Chi's there, I was in Montreal's there, and I just sort of close my eyes and think how does this all go together? And I just start drawing. As long as I get started, I'm good to go. So of course, that's up to you. I can't say what anyone else is moved by. But in principle, this is what we work with, actually. So I came across this quote, which I think sort of sharpens the whole thing, especially in school, which is so full of being right all the time. How to decide if something's true. Not because you hear it repeatedly, not because it's a tradition, not because it's a rumor, not because it has a long history, certainly not. Not because others think this way, not because it's a philosophically argued point, not because it's common sense, not because it agrees with our own opinion, not because it's a belief of our teacher. No, those are not reasons for you to think something's true. Only when you've independently tested it and observed that these things bring benefit and happiness should you accept these things as true. And I've noted, incorporate them in your work. Our job is to investigate this. That's all we do in design. So now I want to talk about the process a little more detailed. Studio. It's hard to start a project, hard to know where to start, hard to know what to do. And I really like this illustration. They're trying to illustrate creation before anything's created. How do you do that? It's just a void. That's why it's so nerve-wracking to do a design project, to create a project. You don't know what to do. We don't know where to go at first. There's just a void. So I always like to think, okay, let's start with the big idea. What does that mean? Normally when you do a desk crit, people, especially at the beginning of the term, it's like, what's your project? Oh, it's on stilts over the water, but it's got a basement. It's made out of titanium. It's kind of floating, but it's not floating. It would go left if it didn't go right. And it's kind of like that. And, I'm making notes of what people are saying because I can't keep track of it. And so, I have a list of 6 things that the building is. The big idea is 6 big things. And what I'm doing in my own mind is I'm seeing this. well, that big idea is kind of fighting with that idea, and this idea is arguing with this idea. It is so complicated. But we need to we need to pass that great void. We need to fill it. And I don't think that's the case. I think we need one idea developed 7 or 8 ways, not 8 ideas initially. All you need is one. And so the point of learning what a plan is, a section, elevation, reflection, all of these are ways of developing one thing. And if you do that, it turns into a story. As you're working, you're telling yourself a story about what you're doing. And eventually, all these things start to resonate about what the big idea is. You started with something a whisper, let's say, of what that thing is, and you begin to build it just by going through these different drawings. Like, I had a student last year. We did a project which was a swimming pool on the Toronto Islands. And this guy had an amazing plan, and it's all he worked on for 6 weeks. The final project was the plan. So he pinned it up at the end, and he realized he didn't do any other drawings, just the plan. And that happens. You know, we get sort of drunk on the idea. And I want to suggest that if you make a discipline of this, like, I've worked on the plan for a few minutes, I'm going to check out a little vignette, I'm going to make a model, then I'll move to this, then to this, you'll never be stuck. You'll always be generating things. And that's the reason we have these drawings. They're used, of course, to construct buildings, but as designers, they're tools for us to actually focus our creativity. So naturally, what happens is that one idea starts to form a hierarchy. We suddenly say, oh, that thing, oh, that thing. But it's always working around a big idea. I find it easier. It's not to say your project isn't complex and full of things. It's just that it's developed organically and genuinely. So designing to me means just learning to investigate what you like in the context of the program, in the context of what's required. But essentially, you're the driver of this. So, you know, then we talk about partie drawings a lot. A partie drawing is just an idea. It's actually not the plan itself. It's very confusing at first. A partie is just an idea, and everyone has their own way of drawing them. And you know, it's a little unfair because it takes like 2 or 3 years to feel like you kind of have some traction. But Peter Zumthor, who some would say is one of the great architects right now in the world, that's his partie drawing of a very famous building, the Val's Bath. You know, you look at that and say, what is that? Well, that's a kind of atmosphere, that's a density, that's an idea of how thick walls are and how big spaces are. This is a partie as well. It's a physical model. It's got an atmosphere to it. It sort of gives you a sense of what the walls are like, maybe. That's how this person works. Or Ando, you know, a great Japanese architect. If you look at all his drawings, they're like this energy to them. So he's not doing that for me or for you. That's how he has something to say. And I encourage you to trust your drawings. I can't draw, quite frankly. I mean, I can keep track of things, but I'm no artist. But this is a kind of beautiful drawing. If he gave you that drawing, you could design the whole building. So these are my kind of summary thoughts. You know, design development, first thought, best thought. That's the instinct, okay? Go with it. If it's totally wrong, you'll grow out of it. But at least you'll never be stuck. And then this is from a poet. One perception must immediately and directly lead to another perception. You have to be disciplined. And that's partly moving through the drawings. It's not work, it's play. It's great. You're going to get paid to do what you love to do. The mind must be loose. You know, it's so difficult if the mind isn't loose. And then take a friendly attitude to your thoughts because, you know, there's a lot of negativity in our minds. We grow out of things, but, you know, we also acquire things. We need to be consciously friendly to our own thoughts. So, just want to, kind of the last chapter here, talk a little about emotions. Anyone know what this illustration's from? I'll give you a hint. It's about a whale. Moby Dick, was illustrated. I love the illustrations. This to me is like, we're up in the boat here in studio, and there's like always something down here. It's a little disturbing at times. And it's a big force. So, let's see what this is about. As I said, I end up doing a lot of desk crits. So after a number of years, I just became so fascinated when people got stuck. It became the most interesting part of the creative process. Also because I get stuck often, but I wanted to just pay attention to getting stuck. So I wrote down the 12 most popular things I heard over the course of a term. Some people say a lot of these things. Some people are just, like they'll only say, this project gives me a headache. But, what does it mean? Can we trust these comments? And I think we can. If you're spinning your wheels in winter, you usually have to take your foot off the gas. And I think in studio it's no different. With the way we're trained to get something is not workable in the creative life. You have to receive things. Spinning my wheels, maybe you've got too many ideas, you need to take your foot off the gas. If you're bored, you have to go back to when you weren't bored. You have to trust this emotional response to your work. That's one of your resources. My favorite is actually, I don't have anything. So you get to someone's desk, how's it going? Not too good, I don't have anything. Then you say, well, what do you have? And they talk for like 40 minutes. They have a ton. But generally, they haven't been trusting that they need to, work with that. So I went into, I think we all have our own way of creating. We all have our own way of getting stuck. And we should get to know that because that's a resource. In the 21st century, you need to know about this. If someone tells you they never get stuck, that person's an idiot. It's not possible with creative work. If you do find yourself in a jam, here are two things I like to suggest. One is the creative timeline. Make a timeline starting with your earliest memory of anything that inspired you. If you got taken to a great place, if you had a great meal, if you saw and got yourself a pair of shoes that you like, whatever moved you, write about it. Write about why. This is to empower the ego again. So what inspires you and why? And here's another way out of a jam. When you don't know what you're trying to create, just ask yourself, what would bring benefit to others? Just get out of the way and ask yourself, how would it help somebody else? I find, between these two poles, you can actually release yourself from sort of unwholesome patterns creatively. So, of course, architects are always trying to change other people's emotions. But, it's good to turn the tables. What about the way our emotions affect our designing? 21st century, we're sort of responsible now for more of ourselves. And a lot of research has been done on this. The science is very, very strong. Research concluded how a person is feeling does affect their creativity. And the work of Barbara Fredrickson in particular, she said, to increase your creativity, you need to cultivate positive emotions and reduce negative emotions, particularly fear and anxiety. Easier said than done. At least somebody's concerned about this, finally. So she called it the broaden and build theory. And she said basically positive emotions, they tested people, showed heightened levels of creativity and inventiveness. So, here's one example. Has anyone seen this kindergarten? Sure you guys have. I mean, are you kidding me? Send the children to the roof to run around? He's lucky he didn't get arrested. But somehow he gets this built, and I think it's a great inspiration. The tree is growing through the building. It's another thing that you're not allowed to do. This building is full of positive experiences for children. Even when you come down the slide, you land on a little mountain. You don't come down to the ground. There's a great TED talk by this architect. If you have nothing on your plate one day, take a look. So she also talked about something called the positivity ratio. What do you think is the ideal ratio of positive to negative thoughts for a human being? So 1 positive to 1 negative, 2 positive to 1 negative, 3 to 1, 4 to 1. Anyone feeling lucky? Any guesses? Yeah? Yes! Brilliant. She said 3 to 1. She said if you hear someone at 4 to 1, they're probably just making it up. She said 2 to 1, you know, that's still too close. 1 to 1, you might be feeling down. She said if you're at 3 to 1, you probably are in a positive state. And again, I think science is starting to measure the impact of these things. That's not 30 years ago even, that's in the last 20 years. I just want to show this project in Finland called the Fish Chapel. Look it up sometime. But the beautiful thing here was it's a remote hospital in Finland. It's a cancer treatment center. And they wanted to build a chapel on the site. So there were like 5 different religions using this hospital. And they couldn't agree on anything, so they joined forces. They got inspired by the building, and they all agreed to fund this building. And there's a great photograph of it under construction where the 5 different religions are kind of circumambulating the whole building. The architecture actually transcended their prejudices and differences. And it's quite a remarkable structure. So finally, I just want to talk about this conference that took place a few years ago because they wanted to get to the bottom of these positive emotions. You know, what is this about? And, you know, what I appreciate here is they didn't just talk to like one kind of person. Educators, philosophers, scientists of all kinds. And all of them were contributing to understanding how these 4 words were important in cultivating positive emotions. The entire conference you can find online if you have the time. It's like, you know, kind of 2 weeks of watching videos. But I was captivated. I sat there for a while and looked at them. So here's the diagram I made of their findings. And I just want to share this with you. They said everything begins with resonance. Resonance. Resonance is when you are connected to another. It could be to another person, it could be to another thing, but there's some sense of connection. If there's resonance, you can cultivate empathy, where you can actually feel something of their plight. So at this point, we're not talking about too much really. Like you could go buy a pair of shoes, the salesman, some resonance, has a bit of empathy. But if you say, I only have $50 and he sells you a $200 pair of shoes, that's not compassion. Compassion is the level at which you actually take action for their benefit. So without resonance, you don't get empathy. Without empathy, no compassion. And then altruism is like the Olympic level. Really extraordinary human beings who have done things. Robert's probably talked about the Holocaust in this light, when people actually put themselves on the line for others. So I think as architects, there is a role to play in the world that we're making where we actually bring these qualities into our work. And the idea behind this is that, and it seems stunningly simple, but compassion can solve problems. We normally don't solve problems with compassion, but compassion solves problems, even creative problems. I'm not just talking about interpersonal, anything. I'm suggesting that the science says that compassion solves problems. So my last few slides, I want to talk about final reviews because this is something I feel personally we need to apologize for because we don't adequately train you to be in control of your review. Who loves presenting their project in front of their professors? Who loves it? Excellent. Who's a little not so excited about it? Few. Thanks for being honest. I mean, just terrorized me. And I realized, you know, there's always pointed fingers and such. Some people are really good at it, but my point is we don't train you for this. We should be training from first year how to be effective communicators because you're going to do that for the rest of your career. You need to get good at this. And so I would suggest framing these opportunities of presentation to actually get better and better, more in control of that presentation. So I recommend people really know what they're going to say before. I know you work right up until the last second sometimes, but what is the first sentence of your presentation? You really want to get to the point where people around you are saying yes, they understand it and they're actually in support of it. But you can easily sabotage these things. So we need to, I think, do a better job of training and practicing, as you would if you were on the stage even, to do a presentation. So it doesn't matter whether you're in first year or TRD1, graduate school, same problems. Think through what you want to say. Write out the key points. Don't leave it to chance. That's going to be trouble. Really nail what you want to say. Storyboard it, which means write it, have your work and the things you're going to say as you move by the panels. Don't get worried about the requirements. I think that's the biggest mistake. Sometimes great projects don't have all the requirements, but they're great projects. So let the narrative, let the big idea shine through. Take a chance. And then practice. Practice with your peers. If you're really ambitious, have someone video you doing a presentation. You look at that once, you'll jump to like a few years. So I have a bibliography here. I guess we'll hand this out at some point if people are interested. From a psychological point of view, if you can only get one book, get the one by David Rico, How to Be an Adult. It solves problems, okay? But if you're, depending on your interests, I can't say enough about these authors. They've really done pioneering work. And I'll just close with this quote from Jung. The greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. And I think we uniquely now have the tools to outgrow these problems. I don't know if we did always, but we do now. So thank you.